Well, good afternoon and welcome on behalf of the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress to what I'm sure will be a very interesting conversation with three experts on digital privacy and security on how we can get right this balance between privacy and security in an increasingly interconnected economy and world in our effort to promote US national security. Our session today will be on the record, and we will be providing an opportunity for audience questions that our moderator, Robert Gerber, is going to bring in somewhere about the middle point of the discussion today of the hour. I do encourage you, if you'd like to ask a question, to submit it whenever you're ready using the Q&A function, and Bob will pull those into the conversation. And if you do want to ask a question, please submit it as early as you think of it, because we'll get to as many as we can, but we'll try to get to them in approximately the order that we receive them. We are very excited to have some great speakers with us today. Jocelyn Aqua, Ken Propp, and Lindsay Gorman, individuals with very deep and significant experience in the area of data privacy and security. This conversation is part of a series that CSPC has been running for some time under the umbrella of our Great Powers Competition program, but specifically on our project on geotechnology competition. That competition that is largely driven by our efforts to compete with China on areas of technology like 5G and artificial intelligence, which is fed by large amounts of data. And so there are several layers of complicated policy-making challenges that go into this issue. Essentially, we have kind of a two-part problem or challenge in terms of competing for technological development and deployment, and at the same time competing in the area of narrative. How can market democracies win the narrative challenge with authoritarian countries over how we handle personal data, and how we're able to do this in a way that allows us to remain competitive on the global stage? We believe that one of the best ways to do that is by leveraging relationships with allies like Europe and Japan. But of course, this is challenging in the fact that there's not an agreed consensus at this point on exactly how we handle data privacy and security. But it is an imperative that we figure out a way to move forward in that area. There is, clearly an election coming up in 1 week that will determine who the next president is. We may see a continuation of the current administration. We may see a completely new administration. Either way, we are likely to have an opportunity to explore some new ideas, some new policy approaches to this challenge of data privacy and security. In our series, we have and will continue to look at some of the policies the current administration has put on the table, including clean networks and others, to deal with some of these challenges, as well as looking at some of the issues being debated in Congress right now. But today, I hope that we'll have an opportunity to examine maybe some new and some innovative ideas and other approaches that will help us determine the pathway forward that is best for the country. So with that, let me go ahead and turn it over to Robert Gerber to manage the conversation today. Bob?
Thank you, Glenn, and thank you to our panelists today. As you mentioned, we've got an election approaching in just 1 week time, and voting is essential in a democracy, but so is having an open discourse like we're having today on policy issues. So in that context, I'm pleased to be the moderator for today's discussion. We are seeing increasing dependence on digital networks, and what that means is that the next administration will face policy challenges, as Glenn mentioned, secure data, secure networks, and competing in a global economy. Especially people with children know the warnings about TikTok, and we're all want to make sure that our web-enabled teleconferences are fully private. So these issues really hit home with people. I'd like to introduce now our speakers. We have two right now, and a third will be joining us a little bit later. Beginning in alphabetical order, Jocelyn Aqua is a principal with PwC US, with PwC's Information Governance and Privacy Practice. And there she provides guidance to companies at the intersection of privacy, information governance, and regulatory risk. She is a former US government privacy official and a prosecutor with 20 years of public and private sector data privacy experience, including 15 years with Department of Justice. Ken Propp teaches European Union law at Georgetown University Law Center, and he is a senior fellow with the Future Europe Initiative at the Atlantic Council. From 2011 to 2015, he was in Brussels at the US mission to the EU, serving as legal counselor. And there, he led US government engagement on data privacy and digital policy in general. Lindsay Gorman, who I think has just joined us, is the Emerging Technologies Fellow at the German Marshall Fund's Alliance for Securing Democracy. She spent over a decade at the intersection of technology development and national security policy, including at the office of US Senator Mark Warner, the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, and National Academy of Sciences. She's a frequent speaker on TV shows on Bloomberg and other networks. And she has a master's in applied science from Stanford. So I want to welcome our panelists. What I'd like to do is go through three questions that are separate but interlinked. And the first question I'd like to pose to Jocelyn, and then have the other panelists chime in. And as Glenn mentioned, we welcome questions from the audience as well. So this is for Jocelyn. Does the United States have the right legal structures in place to safeguard data privacy? And to what degree would national data privacy legislation help, in your view?
That is a question I talk about all the time. I would say that, after 15 years working for the government and explaining to our EU counterparts all the time about the fact that the US has very robust privacy protections in place. We have sectoral laws, we have state laws, we have really a patchwork. I found it to be a very complex conversation to have to showcase all of the different overlapping protections. I would say over the course of my last 4 years in the private sector, realizing how companies have to apply that patchwork, not only the patchwork in the United States with the 50 plus data breach notification requirements, the multiple cybersecurity requirements, the multiple federal, state, different requirements, and then global laws. It is so complex that that I think it's a detriment to our companies. I then also think that the fact that we don't have an omnibus or national consumer data privacy law has really escalated this concern globally as to does our patchwork really work, especially over the last few years where really it's come to light how many different ways that data is being processed where there is a gap in our laws. So I think everybody, both sides of both parties are all in favor of having a national law. I think it's the start of the conversation for how to move forward with SHREMS. It certainly will not solve SHREMS in any way. It won't solve our significant data flow concerns that are happening across the globe, but really it sets us up for having a conversation to justify what we're doing and to have that debate with a even playing field across the globe. I spend a lot of time helping corporations implement a California privacy law and then figuring out how to trickle that down so data subjects in Tennessee and in South Dakota share the same protections in place. And that really becomes a company by company decision at this point because it is a California-based privacy law. Similarly with EU-based privacy law, GDPR, where some companies have applied it globally and some are not, and so giving EU citizens significantly enhanced rights. So I'm a huge proponent of a national law that really takes are protections that we have in place and memorializes them in a way across all states. Now, I think everybody would agree with me there, and I think the biggest issue really becomes that federal preemption or a private right of action, which we just can't seem to agree upon as a country. And I don't necessarily think that this is going to be an easy sell, because this has been the same issue for a very long time. It's what sort of felled the Washington state privacy law that has come up a couple times. It's these very big, passionate issues of, do we want states to have their own rights and do we want citizens to be able to bring claims? And I don't know with what administration that will change, but I think the level of tolerance of not having this law in place is growing thin amongst our consumers, amongst our businesses, and then also in the global arena. And so I'll just share that, and I know other people have thoughts on this as well.
Thank you, Jocelyn. And you mentioned GDPR, which of course is the general data privacy regulation that the European Union has had in place for a little while now. And you mentioned the Schrems case, and I do want to explore that later. But I wanted to ask Lindsay, who worked on Capitol Hill, why don't we have legislation passed yet? Jocelyn mentioned the right of private action, but if it's a bipartisan issue, seemingly, why don't we have legislation?
Thanks, Rob. And I mean, it's a fair question. I would say that I think it is increasingly, and perhaps only recently, been something that there has been increasing consensus on, especially coming from the private sector. The sort of larger corporations, I think, have realized that it actually won't hurt them too much to have a more unified framework, especially I think we've seen the effects of GDPR, where some of that compliance has to happen anyway from those corporations. So we're not seeing the pushback that we used to, and some in fact have even come out, like Microsoft has come out in support of federal legislation. I think the argument that you used to hear and perhaps still do hear, that I think there's some reasonable debate about is, whether these regulations will hamper innovation, and some point to GDPR as potentially stifling innovation, particularly from smaller companies. Now, I think the data on that has been so far inconclusive. We just haven't seen that privacy law in effect for long enough to really be able to say. But I think those are some of the considerations that have gone into why we don't have this federal privacy framework yet. One thing I would just like to add onto Jocelyn's remarks is that from the national security standpoint, this goes beyond just about protecting personal data. I was particularly struck by an NPR study done last year that found that businesses were actually staying quiet on the subject of intellectual property theft coming from China, losing to the tune of over $57 billion per year in economic output and productivity and intellectual capital due to this mostly cyber-enabled intellectual property theft, but they weren't being forced to report it. So I think one of the key elements of a data privacy framework, which is also a data protection framework, is this breach notification requirement that GDPR has, that Brazil is baking into its federal data privacy law, that says if you're hacked, you have to report it, maybe not publicly, but to some regulatory authority within 72 hours, so that we can build a common understanding of how these actors target the private sector. Because ultimately this is about our national competitiveness and our national security that's being under threat from cyber actors that take away our technological competitiveness without incentives on the side of businesses to actually report this theft.
Ken, would you like to comment on what Lindsay was saying about the reporting requirements or any other aspects?
I just wanted to add a general comment that at this point, the United States is wildly out of step with the rest of the world when it comes to adoption of a privacy law. This is happening across the globe in countries large and small. Even China is debating a privacy law that has many serious features to it. There are features to it that some of us would object to, but nonetheless, there is an increasing global consensus. And I think the fact that the United States cannot manage to agree on important issues like the degree of private enforcement and the extent to which states will be able to compete to set their own standards. I think this is looked at not only with puzzlement around the world, but it actually hampers the United States in international negotiations on data transfer issues with Europe, but I think potentially also more broadly.
Thanks, and that might be a good segue, Ken, to ask you a little bit about the Schrems decision and what the impact of that is. Our biggest trading partner in terms of digital trade is the European Union. There's more data flows that go on the transatlantic side than anywhere else in the world. And I wanted to ask you what the implications are of the European Court of Justice ruling on Schrems and how this would affect the idea of a broader framework for data governance.
Sure. I'll spare you all the gory details of the case, but suffice it to say that it is a case in which the EU's highest court applies its privacy law, the GDPR, as well as its Charter of Fundamental Rights, in an effort to discipline US national foreign surveillance practices as they relate to Europeans. And specifically, it took a look at two transfer mechanisms, the Privacy Shield, which was an intergovernmental arrangement, and so-called standard contract clauses, which are contractual means of protecting the privacy of data when it is sent from one country to another. The case involved Facebook, which was one of more than 5,300 companies that subscribed to the Privacy Shield. The Privacy Shield contained elaborate privacy protections, but companies nevertheless had to comply with data demands that came from the US national security community. And that was the nature of the challenge in the case. The Court of Justice found that the protections under the Privacy Shield were not essentially equivalent to those that are conferred under EU law. And specifically, it pointed out that there was a lack of effective legal remedies before an independent and impartial court for persons who wanted to challenge the consequences of surveillance. And it went even further to say that it did not see a principle of proportionality underlying US national security collection efforts, pointing in particular to bulk surveillance programs that are operated by the NSA. The consequence was that it invalidated the Privacy Shield with immediate effect overnight, sending all of those companies scrambling for another means to transfer data. They turned primarily to standard contract clauses. And fortunately, in the same case, the ECJ confirmed the validity of standard contract clauses, but with a very important qualification. It indicated that there was a need for additional safeguards against the risk of NSA surveillance in relation to data transfers to the United States. So now there's an enormous effort underway among companies to figure out what types of additional measures they need to put into place for data transfers to the United States. They're waiting for guidance to come from European regulators on this subject. But in the meantime, they're taking steps like assessing the risk of NSA access to their data transfers. They are engaging in transparency activities, disclosing the extent to which they've received such requests in the past, to the extent that US law allows them to do that. They are considering encryption of data, pseudonymization of data. And finally, many of them are considering whether to localize data in Europe. In other words, not to transfer it to the United States at all, but simply to process it in Europe, which is technically feasible in many, but not all cases. Notwithstanding these steps, the future of standard contract clauses themselves in the transatlantic space is under threat. And that is because there are a series of further regulatory challenges that are pending. One of them involves Facebook itself and the Irish Data Protection Authority, which has moved in Irish court to immediately terminate Facebook's use of standard contract clauses. That litigation will take some time to work out. There are more than 100 cases that have been brought by a privacy activist, by Max Schrems, the same privacy activist who started this case against Facebook, but this time in 30 jurisdictions in Europe. And then finally, there are cases that have been brought directly in court, not before European regulators, but taken directly to judicial tribunals, including one in Germany against Amazon. And no one knows how these cases are going to sort out. It's going to take some time, but we're in for a long period of uncertainty. It's essentially a slow motion crisis in transatlantic relations that's underway. Bob, I know you wanted me to talk about the global implications of Schrems 2. I've just focused on the transatlantic bit of it. Do you want me to?
Yeah, well, maybe I could just say that, I mean, it sounds like companies that were under the privacy shield, they lost that framework. Then they had to go to standard contractual clauses or other mechanisms which were costly, but those are under legal review in Europe as well. It just strikes me that this seems also very 2015, you know, Edward Snowden, you know, government access to data. We're 5 years later now. And with the rise of China and China's influence and outreach in the digital area and trying to promote its own laws, is there a chance that the US and the EU are more like-minded now because we face these common challenges? And if so, do you think we'll see a new privacy shield? And I open this up to Lindsay or Jocelyn if they want to.
I can chime in a bit because, and I'm a little biased because I spent several years of my career working on privacy shield and representing the US government in these negotiations. And I have been working behind the scenes now trying to think about ways where there could be tweaks to make it a privacy shield 2.0. And I'm a little jaded and I'm not sure. I'm frustrated in several ways because I do think that this was a nice compromise of two very different types of privacy philosophies. You know, the privacy shield really matches very similarly to the cross-border data privacy rules in the APEC world, and we have lots of countries who have signed on to that, and that's a very robust program. And really, this was a way to uplift companies that didn't have any mechanism to do anything. But binding corporate rules is a very expensive methodology for getting sign off by the EU. Standard contract clauses are also not as much of a heavy lift as that, but it is. And the privacy shield principles really aligned with the goals of what they wanted most companies to do. And most of those companies are not impacted by US government access to data. And even I think recently when the Department of Commerce, the Department of Justice, and ODNI went and wrote a really complex white paper explaining that, it still just showcased how difficult this is for most US companies, where I think the answer here is I'm not sure they can do very much of anything. So you had a process in place where you uplifted most companies over 5,000 that wanted to do business with Europe, and adhered to these principles. And now with nothing, I'm not sure what the alternative is. And I work and I help companies build out their privacy programs. I also am the privacy ethics leader for my own company and my own data issues, where I have good questions of why, how can we store data in the United States now? Should we be moving our data to Europe? They're very complex issues. And I would say, unfortunately, the law enforcement intelligence communities in all of those countries in Europe are probably acting in the same way, as you can tell from a more recent CJAU decision, which also said that many countries in Europe were also doing the same thing as the United States in many respects, and needed to curtail those behaviors. So it's very frustrating for US companies who work globally. And I'm concerned with if the answer is data localization. That seems to really push against our free flow of data and our ability to do things like develop and innovate for AI and make the world a better place and use data for good, if we're all having it stored in separate instances where no one can touch it. So I know Lindsay looks like she has
That's
something to chime
interesting.
in there.
And I wanted to ask Lindsay also, and please feel free to comment on what Jocelyn said. The EU has been working with Japan on a digital trade agreement of sorts, and I know it's got data privacy in it as well. What about an idea of a US, Japan, Europe data zone? Has that been, what do you think about that, and what are some of your other reflections?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. We're seeing sort of concerning, I would say, elements sort of in the transatlantic relationship. I mean, on the one hand, there's been a very positive recognition, I think, of the challenge that an authoritarian China now poses. There was, always that understanding sort of transatlantically on the threat of Russia, but really seeing China as a threat is something that I think only within the last year, sort of on the other side of the pond, has really come into a mainstream view, even in Brussels and in some of the capitals. And so in that sense, there is, I would say, a will, I think, to address this problem, these authoritarian rises, more in a more united way. But I think that the differences between the United States and many of its European partners in particular on data privacy, on the big tech companies, are some serious roadblocks into these conversations. I mean, the number of discussions I have where what ends up coming up is, well, the US is almost as bad because we're using surveillance for capitalism and to sell people ads. Well, okay, China's using it for repression, but I would think that that's not really in the same league. But I think our differences are being exploited, and so this instinct of Europe to promote sort of a digital sovereignty model, a cyber sovereignty model potentially, and along with that, the data localization part, is, exactly as Jocelyn said, very concerning from the perspective of a free and open internet where anyone can access these technologies. And in fact, that's the model. The cyber sovereignty model is the one that China has been promoting at the UN for the last decade, and Russia has also glommed onto that. Individual states should be able to do exactly what they want within their own borders, and they just have different rules. So I think the sooner that democracies can come together and figure out what those rules should be for democracies, the better an alternative they will have to put forward to countries that maybe fall into the partly free category, many of which are in the global south, where China is targeting a lot of these application layer technological development initiatives, things like smart cities, safe cities that are collecting massive amounts of information on local populations outside of China, and then using them to feed into these AI algorithms without really regard for whether the state should or should not have access to that information. And in fact, giving the state access to information kind of without these legal protections that we would obviously put in place. So yeah, I think, on your question about an EU, US, Japan data sharing, data zone, I mean, I think that's exactly the direction we want to move in to, more clearly specify what do we mean by a democratic internet? What are democratic data protections? And right now, I think the US, because we don't have a sense, even at the federal level, not to mention an international level, we're really hamstrung in those discussions. I don't see how we can lead those conversations when our framework is so patchwork and state by state, and not doing our companies and our national security really a service. So I think, perhaps the EU is trying to lead a little bit in this, but I would also add, more countries to the mix. Our other democratic partners, potentially India, Australia, South Korea, that that share our values. And I think, one interesting proposal that I wonder if data protection, data privacy will or could or should be a part of is this sort of alliance of democracies on technology. Britain has proposed it as the D10 group of democracies. Some people have proposed it as sort of a T12 group, and essentially an informal group of democracies to address technology policy and provide a counter to authoritarians. And so I think this is, potentially an issue that could be taken up there, because right now democracies, and specifically the US, we're not providing any alternative to China right now. We're just saying don't use Chinese technology, but we don't really know what a good version of a smart city should really look like. And I think we need to figure that out if we're going to be serious about promoting our values around the world.
A lot of forward-looking ideas here generated already. Ken?
Yeah, I just wanted to sharpen that concept a little bit. It's worth keeping in mind that what the European Court of Justice required in the way of putting additional safeguards into place for data transfers under the standard contract clauses applies not only with respect to the United States, but it applies globally. So every company that Jocelyn advises is going to have to go through this examination wherever they send data. What are the national security laws? What is the transfer risk? And even if the United States is currently the target, at least it has surveillance laws that are somewhat transparent. That is not the case for many companies. So how are companies supposed to undertake this exercise? Big companies might have some resources to try it, but what about smaller and medium-sized companies? And let's remember, this is all just to satisfy the European Union. What happens when all the other countries around the world that have privacy laws that copy the European Union's start adopting the same jurisprudence about additional safeguards against national security surveillance? So, it is an extremely challenging and complex picture that has developed. So what can you do in that circumstance? And I think there is one direction that is starting to manifest itself that makes sense, and that is there are multilateral conversations that are getting underway to try to develop at least some common principles on government access to commercial data. And these are starting at the OECD in Paris, where Japan put forward an initiative on free flow of data with trust, and it has expanded into this area. The Council of Europe in Strasbourg, which is fundamentally a human rights focused organization with a somewhat different membership, is also interested in pursuing these sorts of discussions. The US government has expressed openness to these sorts of discussions. If you talk to national security lawyers around the US government, they will tell you quite indignantly that they think our surveillance laws compare very favorably to those of other countries when it comes to due process protections and other sorts of individual protections. So I think this kind of work can be constructive. It is something that definitely should be pursued in the next administration. And I think it can over time help improve the political atmosphere for data transfers, both on a transatlantic basis and globally.
I would just add, Robert, I think you're on mute, but I would just add
go
that,
ahead, Jocelyn, you can add something.
that I feel this is such an essentially government activity. And over the last, since July, or even pre-Schrems too, has been pushed down to individual companies. It really just can't be at that stage. These are just such fundamental government activities. And even like the Department of Commerce, who is trying so hard to represent the interests and do this, it can't even just be them. Like, it really is. This is something that I look forward to once the elections are over. Whatever happens, this really needs to be escalated up, as Ken and Lindsay are saying, or both said, to that either multilateral country to country negotiations. It's so difficult to have that obligation from a company side to look into, do the laws of Malaysia apply? What are the national security authorities in Thailand? I mean, this really does become such a huge and impossible undertaking that the solution ends up being data localization, because what else can you do? Or ignoring everything. And when at some point, when there starts to become like fines and enforcement actions, that and statements from certain DPAs in Germany and other places that you can't move data, it really is such a difficult predicament that sometimes my advice is just keep going with what you're doing and showcasing your compliance with privacy in a way that makes you feel like you could be accountable to somebody like the FTC, regardless, because otherwise there's nothing otherwise we're going to end up with nothing while this gets sorted out. So the idea of really pushing it up and making sure that the right people are really focusing this on a political level, because it does become a trade issue. I mean, it really is. You think about the fact that other member states are doing the same thing, if not more, and that other countries across the globe are also doing the same thing, then it really does become like an issue of a trade concern. And both on the and I think our next conversation is a little bit on the 5G and the trade concerns there, but really this is I don't know how else to have these conversations with big companies wringing their hands because they want to do the right thing and they really are trying to meet the requirements, but this is just beyond their knowledge. I mean, whether or not a 702 surveillance is, having to explain what is electronic communication, what is 12333. These are conversations that, with a small retail mom and pop, it's just such a shame that this has to be the focus of a mom and pop retailer that is, has one store in Europe and wants to continue doing business. This is just thinking about it in that way. It just doesn't make sense that it's not a very high level national security government focus.
Right. And you mentioned Malaysia and Thailand, and we have a question from one of the participants that I'd like to read to you, which is, how should the United States and allies approach developing world partners wanting a third way between the West and China? I pose that to the group. Who would like to try to take that? It's about approaching developing partners.
Well, I mean, I think one element of that is something that's already been mentioned by Jocelyn. There are other privacy frameworks out there that are starting to gain traction around the world. One of them is in the APEC region, the cross-border data transfer rules. They have to date attracted limited participation from companies, but they have a more flexible approach, less of a a top-down regulatory approach, more of an approach that embodies accountability on the part of companies. Ideally, I think what one would like to see is kind of a melding of that with the European approach. So far, the EU has not shown itself to be particularly interested in pulling that together. But I think the pressure will continue to grow in that direction. It's frankly difficult to imagine a successful negotiation on this subject at a universal level, that is to say, in a UN format, because you get into so many highly politicized issues of information control. But in the meantime, I think we need to look for regional groupings and other ad hoc approaches.
Thanks, Lindsay. Did you want to add something to that, or I could go to our third big question, which is actually directed to you.
Go to the third one, and I'll join on to that one.
Right. You mentioned something called Alliances of Democracies on Tech, or the T12, and I wondered if you could tell us about that, and how does that contrast with the Clean Networks initiative that the current administration has been rolling out? I understand it has something to do with technology and the digital supply chain, maybe 5G. Could you explain a little bit that to us and where you think it's headed?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the general idea is that these democracies need to be coming to some of these decisions together, and to the point about the developing world to be providing, this potential third way or viable alternative to authoritarian states in the developing world, and to really kind of fuse their resources and their understanding to do that. And there have been a number of initiatives proposed as part of this sort of T12, D10, Alliance of Democracies framework, including 5G, including secure supply chains, potential export controls to prevent more sinister uses of some of these technologies. So I think it's come about because there's a recognition that emerging technologies are shaping democracy. They're shaping how we engage in the information environment. And we have not always been, I think, as this conversation illustrates, completely on the same page. And I think there is an open question about whether we can really get all on the same page, exactly. But perhaps we need a forum to air some of these differences and also figure out where we are aligned. I think, the Clean Network Initiative, from, not being in government, from what I can see of it, it's really this US-led initiative to get other countries to sort of sign up. Around 5G, it seems like it's really, about banning Chinese vendors, and potentially about implementing some of the Prague proposals that go beyond just excluding that particular vendors, but actually establishing some principles for what trusted network equipment is. I think one of the reasons that there are some potential limitations to the Clean Network framework is, as I said earlier, there are areas where the United States really isn't out in front and leading, and really does need sort of input from some of its allies and partners. And I think, one area in particular that I would love to see a more transnational look at, that I think the Clean Network Initiative really hasn't touched, is in the information space and information apps like TikTok, for example, where there's been obviously a lot of chaotic action coming out of the US on, and I think we're still wondering whether TikTok is going to have a future in the United States, being a Chinese-owned platform that potentially has data security and information manipulation, national security concerns built in. But this is, one area where actually some of our European partners are using their data protection authorities to actually investigate these practices that the US government has claimed and what we've seen some reporting on are problematic in the case of TikTok. So I think that having, being on the same page about some of the tools that we can use to go after these national security problems as they arise will actually build a lot more credibility for democracies in addressing them that I think the US currently lacks. So whether that's through, an expanded version of the Clean Network Initiative that, is a little more inclusive and brings in some partners that maybe, the US has something to learn from, or expands to the information arena beyond just networks themselves, I think remains to be seen. But I think that it goes, the need for this allied cooperation does go beyond what we're seeing already.
Ken, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, just a brief observation. Lindsay pointed interestingly to the fact that some European data protection authorities are looking into TikTok under the authority of their data protection laws. I think that points to a commonality in philosophy between the US Clean Network Initiative and European data protection laws, which is that you look to the origins of technology, you look to where data is being sent and who has access to it. This is simply the world that we now live in, and there is a tension there between free trade principles, where the goal is simply to establish to the greatest extent possible the free flow of data across borders, and I think this tension is getting more and more manifest. It's possible that it will become less extreme if we have a change in government in the United States, but I think in its broad outlines, it's probably going to continue on both sides of the ocean.
Well,
Thank you,
Ken,
Ken.
you had mentioned previously, Ken and I talk a lot and debate each other just offline for fun. And you were talking a little bit before about the fact that this really implicates the fact that we publicly talk about China in this way, and that it is a trade issue. It gives it breeds some sort of an analogy that maybe that justified how we treated that for Schrems purposes, because they really thought in the same way that it was an undue government overstep, and that we're just doing the same thing with respect to TikTok, that was an undue government. And I would add one thing. I'm a big fan. There's been some back and forth about the value of the white paper that the government did, but the one thing that you may or may or not agree with, the types of activities that the U.S. government does as part of its national security authorities, but it really does speak to all of the different steps and the approval processes, but also the different purposes for which information is being collected. And it clearly talks about the fact that, our surveillance authorities, our collections are focused on weapons of mass destruction, on terrorism, on counter-espionage, and clearly not on economic espionage, and not on suppression of peoples and their rise in different countries. I think the biggest problem that we have right now is the significant lack of trust in government, and the fact that, despite the fact that this has been the law for decades, that we are not a country that uses our authorities to commit economic espionage, and it's clearly a prohibition, that I think there's just a level of distrust. And I'm not sure how to get back that trust level, but that has been fomenting for decades, and we are significantly different. We uphold ourselves with so many different oversight authorities and multiple levels of rigor to make sure that we adhere to these across the intelligence community, but yet, the level of belief that this is happening, I think until we have, I feel like a huge national data privacy law that's focused on companies, and more trust in the fact that our transparency of what we're doing is in fact what we are doing, it's really hard to have these debates, because even our own people are asking, questions about, can we believe what we hear? And there's a question from the audience that said, how do we distinguish from good government access to data from bad and unjustifiable? And I'm not sure how else to defend it. You have what the law says, you have all of our policies, you have groups like the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board speaking about it, you have inspector generals, but there's still some, concern. There's clear concern, and there's concern by the Court of Justice of the European Union. And that is, again, requires these government to government conversations, and then somehow being able to clearly build the trust of the people, because you can't, no matter how many times you say that the US government does not commit economic espionage, there's a high level of, it seems, distrust.
Some other countries don't believe us when we say that, even though it's true. Let me ask another question, and time is getting a bit short here. And this, we've discussed, the need for legislation in the United States and what a national privacy law would do. But I want to focus on the structures in government. Do we have the right structures in place, whether it's departments or czars or offices, that will enable us to have data privacy and secure networks in the next administration? What are some recommendations you might have, and what are your thoughts on that?
Sure, I can throw out a few there to start. I mean, I think in nations that we have seen implement data protection and data privacy frameworks, that has usually come with a corresponding data protection authority or regulator. So that's probably something that if the United States were to move in that direction, that can, issue regulatory actions, investigate violations, would need that sort of enforcement.
Which we don't currently have in the US. I mean, we have the FTC, right? But we don't have a DPA, data protection authority.
Exactly. Yes. You'd probably want something that is specifically designed around this new legislative framework. On the secure networks piece, I think we've definitely made progress over the last year, but there are a couple areas that I think are still lacking. I mean, one in particular is looking to the future beyond just the individual networks themselves today, but really how countries like China are shaping the standards for the development of the next generation of networks. And right now, we're not really coordinating on a policy level the efforts that are saying, let's exclude Chinese vendors from allied networks, and the efforts which are fairly nascent and very driven only by the private sector, that are saying, here's how we're going to build the next generations of networks so that our technologies are competitive in that one. And the problem I think that we got into with 5G and with Huawei is that we didn't lay the groundwork for our own competitiveness, and we as the United States, but also as our democratic allies and partners. And China came in with this top-down strategy that coordinated between their companies and their delegations at international organizations that actually set these standards to go in to decide what technology goes into the next generation of network. That's something we didn't do. And of course, on top of that, massive state subsidies to prop up their own technologies. So I think, right now we're not looking at this sort of in the long term. We're in, I think, patch and replace mode of, let's make sure we have good enough equipment in the near term, next 5 years. But we could run into the same problem in the next decade if we don't better align this sort of long-term standards development process with the sort of secure network policy that we have in place. So I think that's one area where I think we do need some, better coordination. And I've recommended that we have a future internet director that's, jointly between the National Security Council and the White House Office of Science and Technology to coordinate a private sector working group on 6G technology standards, working with NIST, and that's also mindful of some of these national security concerns that we've been driving overseas. So I think, those sorts of things would help. There's also another piece of it that if we did have a data privacy or data or data protection framework, part of securing the networks is not just getting rid of the bad and untrusted vendors, but actually making sure that as these networks explode access points, that 5G, the whole advantage is that you have billions of connected devices and data going through these networks. If we don't come up with a more comprehensive sort of risk assessment on our 5G networks, beyond just excluding the untrusted vendors, then we're going to just be, massively vulnerable in ways that I think, right now it's maybe a handful of devices that are vulnerable to intrusion. In 10 years, it could be every single object in your house could be a potential entry point. So I don't know whether a new sort of agency or how that would really get mediated out bureaucratically. But there certainly need to be some sync up between the data protection and data privacy framework and making sure that all these access points are secured.
Yeah, I note that some countries have a Ministry of Digital Economy. But Ken, it looks like you have something to say about that. Is there a downside to creating a whole new institution? Don't we have the team telecom working in the interagency to coordinate on some of these issues?
Well, I mean, simply on the issues of privacy as they relate to surveillance, I would note that there is already quite good coordination that goes on among agencies at the staff level, at the working level. Between the people who focus on law enforcement issues, the people who focus on national security issues, the people who focus on commercial privacy issues. I think what has been lacking, and this is not just a criticism of the current administration, but it goes back years, is some central coordination, some high-level engagement at the level of the NSC and the NSC. So, I mean, my suggestion is really rather modest. It's not for a new institution. It's not for a new czar. It's simply to just ensure that there is high-level attention to this difficult complex of issues going forward.
I would add, from my perspective, the FTC has worked over the last few years to put out a lot of information about how they think about data protection and data privacy. They've had amazing all-day seminars and learning experiences and calling out for papers. And there's so much information in coordination with NIST. I think the biggest problem with the FTC, and they've rightly said it, is they don't have the funding and staffing to really enforce across the United States the way if we had a new federal data privacy law that it would need to happen. And also, not every regulated, there's so many other regulatory bodies, then FTC lacks jurisdiction over some of them. So I would say I'm not sure I would need another body, but something that gave FTC perhaps additional authorities over and this is where, just like we have the patchwork of laws and the different sectoral laws, we have so many different oversight bodies. Our financial institutions have different regulatory bodies than, and the FCC, FTC, OCC. There's so many different bodies. Explaining that to the Europeans is also mind-boggling. They just don't get that. And so if we're giving FTC additional authorities, what does that mean? Are they going to be regulating across industries that they didn't have access to? They would sometimes argue, well, if it has to do with consumer privacy, they do have a role, but I don't think it's as clear. And so I would say some clarity there in funding, and if we didn't have a DPA or a data protection authority as a separate entity.
Great. Those are really interesting perspectives from all three of you. We could keep talking about these issues. There's so much here. Unfortunately, we're out of time now. I just want to say we've talked about data privacy, securing networks, and as Lindsay said, laying the groundwork for our own competitiveness. So I hope the discussion's been useful for everyone. I want to hand it back over to CEO of the Center, Glenn Nye.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate. The conversation could definitely go on for several more hours, but there's a lot to unpack here. I want to thank our speakers for laying out some of the key challenges and also putting on the table some of the ideas that can get us where we need to be. I think it's not for a lack of ideas that we're struggling to solve this problem. I think you've all identified some of the challenges in working these questions through a challenging legislative process, dealing with an executive branch which is interested in the issue, but where there's no single point of decision-making on it. And so it is difficult. I do want to emphasize how important this notion of the rule of law narrative is. You've all laid out challenges to our system, whether it comes to the way we perceive our government's approach to data or the way we perceive our private sector approach to data. And yet I feel very strongly that the United States ought to be very well placed to win the narrative battle with a country like China in comparing our rule of law approach to theirs. But it remains a narrative battle that we need to win. And so it requires additional attention and a consistent focus from all the players in the space. I want to thank our speakers for providing that consistent attention on this and for helping us navigate these issues. We intend very much to stay engaged on this question as we get past the election, whatever the next administration looks like, in providing and sharing some of your thoughts with the policymakers and helping guide that discussion. As we move into next year, it's a challenge we have to win. Lindsay, thank you for your perspectives, particularly having spent time working with one of my senators, Senator Warner in Virginia. It's clear that I can see how you have collaborated in your thought in terms of your policies on some of these questions. And Ken, your experience and time representing the United States in Brussels and being right in the middle of the European discussion on this. And Jocelyn, your time between being in the executive branch and now on the private side, you all bring an amazing wealth of experience to this conversation. So I want to thank you for sharing this time with us. And I also want to say thank you to Robert Gerber, who spent a career of time in the Foreign Service, including representing us in France at the embassy in Paris, discussing digital issues, and at the US Trade Rep and at the State Department, now as CSPC Senior Fellow. Appreciate your very capable moderation of the discussion today. Let the discussion continue. And thank you all to our participants for spending this hour with us. We will see you all soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.